Dean noticed it halfway through the second verse. The main spotlight had stopped following him and was now aimed at someone in the audience. A frozen beam of white light that turned one woman's evening into something unbearable. Listen closely, because the way he handled the next 90 seconds would determine whether this became a story about grace under pressure or a disaster that cleared the room. The woman was sitting 8 rows back, center section, and the light hit her face with the kind of intensity that made her squint immediately. 3,000 watts of tungsten halogen brilliance, designed to cut through stage smoke and distance to make a performer visible from the back of the room, was now focused on a civilian who'd come here expecting an elegant evening of dinner and music, not an inadvertent interrogation by spotlight. Dean kept singing, his voice smooth and unhurried, but his eyes tracked the situation even as his body stayed perfectly positioned at the microphone. The spotlight was supposed to follow him as he moved across the stage, a gentle dance between performer and light operator that happened so naturally, most audiences never even noticed it. The operator sat in a booth at the back of the room, hands on a control wheel that adjusted the gimbal-mounted fixture, tracking Dean's position and anticipating his movements, so the light arrived where he was going before he got there. But now the beam was locked in place, and the woman caught in it was starting to raise her hand to shield her eyes. Dean could see her blinking rapidly, her pupils contracting against the assault of light, her face taking on that expression people get when they're trying to maintain composure in an uncomfortable situation, but don't want to cause a scene. The band played on behind him, unaware. The audience in the darker sections of the room hadn't realized anything was wrong yet. They were still focused on Dean, still listening to the melody, still caught up in the easy elegance of the performance. But Dean could see what was coming. The woman was uncomfortable, getting more uncomfortable by the second, and in about 30 seconds, she was going to stand up and try to move out of the light. And when she did, the entire room would notice. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? He finished the verse and moved smoothly into the chorus, buying himself a few more seconds to think. The light should have followed him. That's what it was supposed to do. Track his movement, keep him illuminated, let the audience see his face and his gestures, while the rest of the room stayed in comfortable semi-darkness. But instead the beam was frozen, and the woman trapped in it was now covering her face with both hands, and the people at her table were starting to look concerned. Dean had performed through equipment failures before, microphones that cut out mid-song, stages where the piano was out of tune, venues where the air conditioning failed in the middle of summer, and everyone sweated through their formal wear. But a frozen spotlight, aimed at an audience member, that was new. That was the kind of technical problem that could turn embarrassing fast, because the longer it went on, the more it looked like someone's mistake, and the more the audience would start to wonder why nobody was fixing it. The woman tried to adjust her position in her seat, angling away from the light, but the beam was too wide and too direct. There was no escaping it short of standing up and walking out, and Dean could see her weighing that option, trying to decide whether drawing attention to herself by leaving was worse than sitting there and enduring the harsh glare burning into her retinas. Most performers would have stopped the song right there, called out to the light booth, made a joke about technical difficulties, given the operator a chance to fix it while the audience laughed it off. But Dean had learned over the years that sometimes stopping made things worse. Sometimes the best way to handle a problem was to acknowledge it without making it the center of attention, to fix it quietly while keeping the show moving forward. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, actually. Atlantic City, 1957, a Tuesday night show at a smaller venue, maybe 1,200 people. He'd been younger then, less confident in his ability to read a room and make the right call under pressure. The microphone had cut out halfway through a ballad, and instead of working around it, he'd stopped everything, made a big deal about it, called attention to the technical failure, asked the sound engineer to fix it right then, while the entire audience sat there watching and waiting. It had taken 6 minutes. 6 minutes of dead air, while the engineer troubleshot cables and connections. 6 minutes of Dean standing on stage with nothing to do but crack increasingly awkward jokes that got fewer and fewer laughs as time went on. 6 minutes of watching the audience's attention drift away, their engagement with the evening crumbling under the weight of an extended technical interruption. When the microphone finally worked again, and he tried to pick up where he left off, the magic was gone. The intimacy he'd built over the first half of the show had evaporated. People were checking their watches, whispering to each other, mentally calculating how much longer the show would run. He'd salvaged it, eventually, but it had taken him another 20 minutes of his best material to win the room back, and even then it never quite recaptured what they'd had before he'd stopped. He'd sworn after that night that he'd never let a technical problem become the story again. Better to work around it, adapt in real time, keep the momentum going, than to stop everything and force the audience to sit through the boring reality of equipment repair. The show wasn't about cables and circuits, it was about feeling and flow, and the moment you broke that flow, you risked never getting it back. He shifted his position on the stage, moving stage right, and watched to see if the spotlight would follow him this time. It didn't. The beam stayed exactly where it was, locked onto that woman 8 rows back, and now the tables around her were noticing. People were glancing up at the light source, trying to figure out why the spotlight wasn't on Dean anymore. The murmuring was starting, that low buzz of confusion that could turn into full-blown distraction if he didn't handle it in the next 60 seconds. Notice what Dean did next, because this is where his years of experience made the difference. He kept singing, but he adjusted his volume and his positioning so that even without the main spotlight, the audience could still see him. The stage had other lights, softer fill lights, side lights, footlights, and Dean moved into a position where those lights illuminated him enough to keep the focus on the performance. At the same time, he caught the eye of his bandleader, Tony, and gave him a subtle signal. Not the kind of gesture the audience would notice, just a slight shift in his hand position that Tony had learned to read over hundreds of shows together. Tony understood immediately. He signaled the band to stretch the instrumental break, giving the saxophone player a longer solo that would hold the audience's attention while Dean dealt with the spotlight situation. The music swelled, the sax player stepped forward into one of the side lights, and for a moment the room's focus shifted away from Dean and onto the musician. That gave Dean maybe 20 seconds. 20 seconds to get the light operator's attention and get that spotlight moved off the woman before she stood up and walked out, before the discomfort turned into a scene, before the whole room realized something had gone wrong. He turned toward the light booth at the back of the room and raised his hand in a clear, deliberate gesture, a simple motion that meant stop, reset, redirect. The light operator should have seen it. That was the whole point of the hand signals they'd established during the sound check earlier that afternoon. But the light didn't move. The beam stayed frozen on the woman, who was now leaning forward with her elbows on the table and her hands covering her face completely. And that's when Dean realized this wasn't just an operator error. Something was mechanically wrong with the spotlight itself. Either the controls had locked up or the fixture had jammed. But whatever the problem was, it wasn't going to be fixed with a simple hand signal. The countdown in his head shifted. The band could stretch this solo for maybe another minute, tops, before it would start to sound repetitive and lose the audience's interest. That meant he had maybe 90 seconds total to make a decision, stop the show completely and deal with the problem directly, or find a way to work around it and keep the evening moving forward. Wait, because what happened in those next 90 seconds changed how everyone in that room would remember the night. Dean walked to the edge of the stage, moving casually, like he was just enjoying the music and wanted to get closer to the audience. He positioned himself directly in front of the frozen spotlight, putting his own body between the beam and the woman. The light hit his back instead of her face, and suddenly, she was in shadow, relief visible even from where Dean stood. She lowered her hands, blinked a few times, and looked up toward the stage, with an expression that was half gratitude and half confusion. The audience noticed the move, but they interpreted it as part of the performance. Dean getting intimate with the crowd, stepping down from the elevated stage area, connecting with the people in the front sections. Nobody realized he'd just used his own body to block 3,000 watts of light that had been burning into someone's eyes for the last 45 seconds. But Dean couldn't stay there forever. The saxophone solo was winding down, and in about 30 seconds, he was going to have to move back to the microphone and continue the song, which meant he needed a more permanent solution, and he needed it fast. He glanced toward the light booth again, and this time he saw movement. Someone was climbing the ladder to the spotlight platform, probably a technician who'd been called in to fix whatever had jammed. But mechanical fixes took time, and Dean didn't have time. He had a room full of people who'd paid good money for an elegant evening of entertainment, and standing in front of a broken spotlight while a technician troubleshot equipment wasn't what they'd signed up for. So he made the call. He signaled to the house lighting operator, a different person than the spotlight operator, and gestured for them to bring up the ambient stage lighting. Not full brightness, which would kill the mood and the atmosphere, but enough to give him coverage so he could move around the stage without needing that frozen spotlight. The house lights came up gradually, professionally, in a way that most of the audience probably didn't even notice. The room got slightly brighter, the stage got more evenly illuminated, and suddenly Dean could move back to the microphone without leaving that woman exposed to the harsh beam again. He stepped back into position as the saxophone solo ended, caught the timing perfectly, and came back in with the next verse, like nothing had interrupted the flow at all. His voice was warm and easy, his posture relaxed, and if you were sitting anywhere beyond the first 10 rows, you probably had no idea that anything had gone wrong. But the people close to the stage knew. They'd seen the woman covering her face. They'd watched Dean reposition himself to block the light. They'd noticed the subtle hand signals and the careful adjustment of the house lights. And what impressed them wasn't just that Dean had handled the problem, but that he'd done it without making a big production out of it, without embarrassing the woman or the technical crew, without breaking the mood of the room. Remember this moment, because this is exactly the kind of decision that separates performers who can handle a crisis from performers who just hope nothing goes wrong. The frozen spotlight stayed aimed at that same spot for the rest of the song, a useless beam of light pointed at empty space while Dean performed under the house lights, and the technician worked on fixing the mechanical jam. Nobody in the audience seemed bothered by it. Most of them probably assumed it was intentional, some kind of artistic lighting choice. Only the people who'd been paying very close attention understood that they just watched Dean Martin quietly solve a problem that could have derailed the entire evening. When the song ended, the applause was strong and sustained through the venue. Dean took a small bow, gestured to the band, and then, and this is the detail that people would talk about later, he looked directly at the woman who'd been caught in the light, made eye contact, and gave her a small nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing that drew attention, just a brief moment of acknowledgement that said, "I saw what happened, I'm sorry that happened, and I hope you're okay now." The woman smiled, clearly relieved, and Dean moved smoothly into the next number with practiced ease. Backstage during the break between sets, Dean found the technical director standing near the equipment lockers with a pained expression. The man started apologizing before Dean even reached him. "The gimbal locked up," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "We do maintenance on that rig every week, and it just froze. I've never seen that happen before. I'm sorry, Mr. Martin, that shouldn't have happened." Dean set down his drink and looked at the man for a moment. The technical director was in his 50s, had been running shows in this venue for over a decade, and Dean had worked with him on at least 4 previous engagements. He was good at his job, meticulous about preparation, the kind of professional who triple-checked everything before curtain and kept spare parts in the equipment lockers for exactly this kind of unexpected failure. "Did you get it fixed?" Dean asked. "Yeah. We bypassed the gimbal and locked the spot to manual control. It'll follow you fine for the rest of the night, but someone's gonna have to operate it by hand instead of using the tracking system, old school style, like we did before they invented the motorized rigs." Dean nodded. Manual operation meant more margin for human error, but it also meant a human being was directly responsible for the light's position, someone who could make instant decisions and adjustments without waiting for mechanical systems to respond. In some ways it was actually more reliable. "That'll work," Dean said. "And the woman who got caught in the light, is she still out there?" "Far as I know, yeah. Her table didn't leave. I sent someone to apologize and comped their drinks for the rest of the evening. Offered to move them to a different table if they wanted, but they said they were fine staying put." Dean appreciated that. It meant the woman hadn't been so traumatized by the experience that she'd fled the venue. It meant his handling of the situation had worked. She'd been uncomfortable, but not driven away, embarrassed, but not humiliated. Dean nodded. "Good. Make sure they know it was equipment failure, not operator error. Last thing we need is someone thinking we did that on purpose." "Already handled," the technical director said. "But I gotta say, the way you dealt with that out there, blocking the light with your own position, signaling for the house lights, keeping the flow going, that was some pretty impressive problem solving." Dean shrugged. "That's the job. Equipment fails. Things go wrong. You deal with it as smoothly as you can, and you try not to let it wreck the evening for everybody else." "Still," the technical director said, "most performers would have stopped the show and made us fix it right then. You kept going. Stopping would have made it bigger than it needed to be," Dean said. The woman was uncomfortable, not in danger. The situation was embarrassing, not dangerous. So the best thing to do was minimize the embarrassment and fix it quietly. Make a big scene out of it, and suddenly everyone's focused on the problem instead of the performance. The technical director managed a small smile. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," Dean said. "It's just necessary. You do this job long enough, you learn that the audience doesn't want to see you sweat. They want to see you handle problems with the same grace you bring to everything else. Show them you're rattled and they'll get rattled. Show them you've got it under control, and they'll trust you to keep the evening on track." The second set went flawlessly. The spotlight followed Dean on manual control, operated by a technician who'd been doing this job for 15 years and could track a performer's movement with precision born of thousands of hours of practice. Dean opened with an upbeat number that had the whole room clapping along, moved through a medley that showcased the band's range, and closed with a ballad that brought the energy down to something intimate and warm. And during that final ballad, Dean noticed something. The woman who'd been caught in the frozen spotlight. She was watching him with a different kind of attention now, not the casual appreciation of someone enjoying a show, but the focused awareness of someone who understood they'd witnessed something beyond the music. She'd seen him handle a crisis in real time, seen him make decisions under pressure, seen him protect her comfort while keeping the entire room engaged and entertained. When the performance ended and Dean took his final bow, she was among the first to stand for the ovation, and when he left the stage and the house lights came up, he saw her making her way toward the stage exit, where performers usually signed autographs and shook hands with guests. He met her near the side door, and before he could say anything she spoke first. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what you did with the light. I didn't know whether to stay or leave, and then you just handled it, made it okay." Dean smiled. "I'm sorry that happened to you. That's not the kind of evening anyone should have to sit through. But you turned it into something else," she said. Something that actually made the evening more memorable, not worse. I was sitting there thinking, this is a disaster. This is ruining the whole night. And then I noticed you'd moved to block the light, and I realized you'd seen what was happening, and you were fixing it without making a big announcement about it, without making me feel like I'd become the center of attention in a bad way. Her companion, a man who'd been standing quietly beside her, spoke up. I work in event production, corporate conferences, mostly, and I've seen technical problems handled about every way you can imagine. Usually, when something goes wrong, the performer either ignores it completely, or they stop everything and make a big show of being patient while the crew scrambles. What you did tonight, adapting in real time, protecting the audience member's dignity while keeping the performance moving, that's masterclass level professional work. Dean appreciated the recognition, but he deflected it with characteristic grace. It's just part of the job. The trick is remembering that the technical problem is never the real problem. The real problem is how it affects people in the room. Dean appreciated that more than she probably realized, because that's what the job really was. Underneath all the music and the charm and the entertainment, it was about handling the unexpected with enough skill that the audience could relax and trust that whatever happened, the evening was in good hands. Years later, people who were at that performance would remember it in different ways. Some remembered the music. Some remembered the way the spotlight had frozen and Dean had adapted. Some remembered that final ballad and the way it had settled over the room like a warm blanket. But the people who really understood what they'd witnessed, the ones who'd been paying close enough attention to see the hand signals and the repositioning and the careful management of a technical crisis, they remembered something deeper. They remembered watching someone who'd spent decades learning his craft demonstrate exactly what mastery looked like under pressure. Not flashy heroics, not dramatic gestures, just steady, competent, graceful problem-solving that kept 5,000 people entertained while simultaneously protecting one woman's dignity and comfort. That's what separated Dean Martin from 100 other talented singers who could hit the same notes and deliver the same jokes. He understood that the performance wasn't just about what happened on stage. It was about everything that happened in the room, every person's experience, every technical element, every moment of potential disruption that could pull people out of the spell you were trying to create. And he'd learned, through years of shows in hundreds of venues, under every kind of condition imaginable, that the best way to handle problems wasn't to pretend they weren't happening. It was to acknowledge them silently, address them efficiently, and move forward with confidence that the audience could trust you to keep the evening exactly what they'd come for. The frozen spotlight became a story that spread through the entertainment industry, not as a cautionary tale about equipment failure, but as an example of professional grace under pressure. Other performers heard about it and nodded in recognition, understanding exactly the kind of split-second decision-making Dean had demonstrated. Technical crews heard about it and appreciated that he'd protected them from embarrassment while still getting the problem addressed. And audience members who'd been there that night told the story to friends and family, not as the night something went wrong at a Dean Martin show, but as the night I watched Dean Martin handle a crisis like it was nothing. Because that's what it had looked like to most of them, like nothing. Like Dean had simply adjusted his position on stage, and the problem had solved itself. They didn't see the calculations behind it, the years of experience that informed every choice, the careful balance between addressing the situation and not making it worse by overreacting. They just saw smooth, effortless professionalism, which is exactly what Dean intended them to see. And in the moments after the show, standing in the quiet backstage area, while the crew broke down equipment and the audience filtered out into the night, Dean thought about that woman's words. You turned it into something else. That was the real skill, wasn't it? Not avoiding problems. Problems were inevitable, but transforming them into something that didn't diminish the experience, taking the unexpected and folding it into the evening in a way that made it feel like part of the plan all along. He'd been doing this job for over 20 years, and he still found new situations that required new solutions, still encountered technical problems he'd never seen before, still made judgment calls based on incomplete information and hoped they'd turn out right. But the core principle never changed. Take care of the room, protect the people who trusted you enough to spend their evening with you, handle the problems with the same grace and professionalism you brought to every other aspect of the performance. That woman had walked into the club, expecting an elegant evening of music and entertainment. She'd gotten that, but she'd also gotten trapped in a 3,000-watt spotlight through no fault of her own. And because Dean had recognized the situation quickly and handled it carefully, she'd left with a positive memory instead of a negative one. That mattered. That was the difference between a performer who just sang the songs and a performer who understood that the job was bigger than the music. The equipment failure would be fixed by tomorrow. The gimbal would be replaced or repaired. The technical crew would implement new checks to make sure it didn't happen again. But the way Dean had handled it, that would be remembered long after the mechanical details were forgotten. Because in the end, people don't remember the problems. They remember how you made them feel when those problems occurred. And Dean Martin had built his reputation on making people feel like everything was going to be just fine, especially when things threatened to go wrong.